Thank you so much, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this conflict management and de-escalation training. My name is Tanagra Melgarejo Pulido, and I am the National Learning and Engagement Strategist for the National Harm Reduction Coalition, and I'll be one of your facilitators today. I want to allow my colleague and friend to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here and doing work in the city that Tanagra and I both live in. I'm Savannah O'Neill, and I'm the Associate Director of Capacity Building at the National Harm Reduction Coalition.
And we're thrilled to be joined by you all today. If you haven't done so yet and you're joining us, if using your chat box, we want to ask you to share your name, pronouns, and the organization you're in and the location of the organization where you're joining us from this beautiful East Bay. And I also want to name that the Harm Reduction Coalition put out about 3 years ago a North Star statement, which is the driving force behind our work. It's the way that we envision ourselves showing up to this work and how we want to build a future, right? And it states that National Harm Reduction Coalition creates spaces for dialogue and action that help heal the harms caused by racialized drug policies. We want to acknowledge that the war on drugs is a war on people. It's a war on people of color. It's a war on Black and brown communities. It's a capitalistic war, and that it impacts all of us, impacts our communities, impacts our families, and impacts the way in which we can show up to do our work. And so we want to name that, and we want to name that through all of these different avenues, through our policy and advocacy work, through our gathering folks together, through regional and national conferences, through our training and technical assistance, which is part of what we're doing today, through our overdose prevention work and recognizing overdose prevention as a community response that should be led by people that use drugs, their families and friends, and finally through our resources and publications. I encourage you also to, if you haven't done so yet, to visit our website where you can find more information about this and other resources that you may find useful for your work. And if there's anything in that website that you're looking for, you can find, please don't hesitate to email myself or Savannah. We'll be happy to connect you with the resource or with the person that probably has access to it. If you please have any accessibility needs, you can direct message Savannah or myself and let us know. We want to encourage folks as much as possible to be on screen. It's really, really hard. One of the things that is the hardest, well, I will say, there's many things that are really hard in this particular moment that we're living in, right? But for me as a trainer and a facilitator, it's so hard to do this work not with people in the room. Because there's nothing that can substitute that energy, that sense of community that you can build with folks in the same space. And so we have to do that virtually and online. And so for me, seeing someone's face is a way to at least, you can see I move my hands. I'm from Puerto Rico. I'm used to speaking with my hands, like I have this sense of I want to be connected to folks. And so this is a way for me to get some of that connection. So if you feel comfortable and you don't have accessibility needs today and you feel that you can turn on your camera, we would love that. We're also using closed captions through this training as well. So folks can also go along with those if they need to. And now I want to do some housekeeping for us. We would love for you, if possible, to add your name and also pronouns to your name. And if you need to do that, you can hover over your photograph, and you'll see that there's this little blue box with 3 little dots. What you do is you hit that, you click that, and you find rename. And then you can add your pronouns there or your name as you would like for us to see it. And you can also do that through your phone as well if you're using the mobile version of Zoom. We love for folks to chat. And we want to ask you, if you're not chatting or asking questions or engaged in a conversation with us, that we ask you to please keep your microphone on mute so we can minimize other noises. Use the chat to chat with us, to let us know how you're thinking, to respond, to ask questions, to communicate with one another. So absolutely, we would love and encourage the use of the chat box for that. And also the use of the emojis to let us know how you're feeling, if you are feeling good, if you're if you're in agreement with something, and if you're not in agreement, you can also let us know like this, and you can make your own emojis as well. And finally, technological issues happen, and we just try to roll with them. Hopefully today will be a day where technology will be kind to us. But if it's not, we will figure it out together. And also, this is not a technological housekeeping situation, but I do have a dog that has a very contentious relationship with anybody that walks by or with the post person. So if you hear the dog bark, it may mean that they are barking at the post person, and I'll mute myself and let her not bark anymore, and then I'll come back. So I'm apologizing ahead and in advance for that. And so in terms of our workshop today, what we're doing, we're in the midst of the introduction, and we're going to do group agreements really soon. And then we'll enter right into conflict and escalation. And there we want to have a brief understanding of trauma, or go over some of what trauma is and the impact of trauma and how it connects to escalation, and defining conflict. Then we'll move into recognizing conflict. What does it look like, feel, or sound like? And then the role of our self-awareness in managing or de-escalating, hopefully, conflict, or escalating in this case. And then we'll move into strategies for de-escalation. So what are some of the things that we as providers, as folks that are engaging with community members in different ways, what are some of the things, the tools we can use, tools that we can add to our already growing toolbox, right, to bring into a situation that might be getting escalated, for us to be able to de-escalate it or to help, diffuse it. And then we'll have some closing. And I know that Jacqueline will be sharing some evaluation materials with you after. And the idea for us today here in this space is to help us identify what escalation can look like, and then work around thinking of how do we have contingency planning to manage conflict, and what are some of the tools that we can have with us or that we can share with others to help folks not only recognize when situations are escalating and how we're situation and we're creating more escalation, but also what are the things that we can do then to de-escalate a situation, or a situation that involves conflict between us and participants. And so we're here in this learning community today, and I want to share some group agreements so that we can all be in community together. And the first one is take space and make space. So I want to encourage folks to ask questions, to share comments, ideas. That's really important to make this space vibrant. And I also want to encourage those of us that tend to do that really often to take a step back so that we can make space for folks that may not necessarily traditionally do that to do so. So if you're one of those folks that hangs back and has a lot to say, but you're shy about saying it, we want to encourage you to step up and take that space. And if you're like me, who has a lot to say and is not shy about taking that space, I need to think about, moving and taking, making space for people. When we are sharing, I want to encourage us all to use I statements. I can only speak from my own experience, right? I cannot speak for all Puerto Rican women or for all Puerto Rican cisgender women or queer women, right? Because it's my own experience, Tanagara's experience. And I think that's really important that way we don't invisibilize other folks' experience when we make those blanket statements. So it's really, really important to speak from the I. Another thing that I find really useful is to ask this question to myself sometimes, which is, why am I still talking? Sometimes I'm sharing a thought, it looked really good in my head, I started saying it, and all of a sudden I forgot where I was going. So that's the moment to hit pause, stop, and say, why am I still talking? And let's just wrap it up, right? Because we may just be going in a direction where we not be able to come back. The other thing I want to share is the Vegas rule, which is what happens in Vegas stays where? In Vegas, right? So what happens here today in this space stays here in this space. We want to create a space that feels safe for folks to share, particularly experiences or, thoughts. And we want to make sure that we're respecting that. And so I would love for us to commit to making sure that that space is created by what we say here stays here. And finally, I want to encourage folks to say it rough. And what that means is that sometimes I know for myself, I tend to hold back when I don't feel I have the correct language or the right language or the right terminology. And if I hold back and I don't ask the question or I don't say what I'm thinking, then I don't get to process it, unpack it, and really reframe it in a way that makes sense. And so I want to encourage us when, if we're feeling that, to say, I'm going to say it rough, right? Or say it ugly or say it rough. And also understand that if I say it rough, sometimes someone is going to say, ouch. And that we as a community can hold those two things, right? And that we can create space to unpack what was said rough in a way that takes into account, you know, the emotions and the feelings of folks that may have felt ouch, and that we can reframe it in a way that all of us feel comfortable then moving forward with. I want to ask folks if these agreements look good to you and they make sense and you're comfortable with them, to please use the emojis. That you can use your finger if you're on camera like this, or if you want to use your emoji, the little thumbs up emoji, to let us know that you're in agreement. And I'm going to do a quick scroll to see, or you can type it in the chat box. I agree. Makes the I'm looking. Thank you. Absolutely. Yay. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Coming back now. Awesome. Perfect. So let's just dive in. And we want to start thinking about conflict management and escalation by having a conversation or thinking about what trauma is and its relationship to conflict and escalation. So when we think of trauma, what is trauma? And folks can either, if you feel comfortable, you can unmute yourself. If you would like to say it out loud, or you can type it in the chat box. Manuel is sharing adverse childhood events. Yes, adverse childhood events fall into the category of trauma and can be traumatic. Another colleague is sharing enduring situations that can be violent. Absolutely. That is another way that trauma shows up. Is anything that makes us feel unsafe. Yes, trauma can trigger feelings of feeling unsafe, feeling out of control, feeling disjointed, right? And discombobulated, disconnected from self and from the moment. It is also a reaction to an event or occurrence, something that happened that impacted us, right? It's a situation that we're holding that is making us feel unsafe, that is making us feel unsettled, right? And that impacts our safety, or sense of well-being and safety. Is an experience that makes you feel threatened physically or emotionally, right? And it can be a death in the family. Someone is giving that as an example of a traumatic experience. Absolutely. Is as well as witnessing something that is violent or threatening. That is another example of something that can be really traumatic, right? Another colleague is sharing that trauma is a negative experience that makes us feel unsafe and affects our future choices. Absolutely. And I love that, because yes, trauma is not something that happens once and then stops, right? For some folks, the impact of trauma can be long lasting. It can show up in times and moments that we're not even aware that it's showing up, right? And that it can have lasting effects for folks. That doesn't mean that folks cannot look at trauma and figure out ways to address it, right? To manage it and to handle it. But particularly us that are living under these systems that are set up to do exactly what they're doing, which is to hurt and harm people, we're constantly navigating trauma in multiple settings and trauma in multiple ways, right? And so when we think of trauma, I want to share this definition with you from SAMHSA, which is that individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being, right? So I think this definition encompasses a lot of what folks have already shared, right, in the chat box around what trauma is, right? So it can happen to a person, individual trauma, and it can result from one event, for a series of events, or for a set of circumstances, right? That we experience as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that its effects are lasting, right? and that impacts our individual physical and mental and social, emotional, spiritual well-being, right? So it really impacts the whole person, right? Impacts holistic, um, the human being, right? And so when we think of this, we need to think also that trauma is structural, historical, and intergenerational, right? That whole communities experience trauma. And we can think about, when I think of California, I think about settler colonialism. I think of, communities that continue to experience racism, hyper surveillance by the state, right? I think about natural disasters here in California. I think of fires as one of the things that it's incredibly traumatizing and traumatic for people, right? I am from the land of the hurricane. So for me, whenever I think of a hurricane, doesn't matter where it's at, all of my pelitos, all my hairs in my neck stand up, right? Because I'm like, oh my God, because I've experienced that. So for me, even now saying it to you, I am feeling it in my body, right? Floods, for folks that live in communities that flood, all of those things that have to do with natural disasters, and also circumstances that are inflicted by one group on another, right? Like the war on drugs, which is a war on people, the stealing or usurping of lands through settler colonialism, which also involves forced relocation, right? Servitude, mass incarceration, any of that stuff, it's ongoing, and the community is continually exposed to that history, right? And it's trauma that is transmitted from one generation to the next, right? So when we think of this, we think about epigenetics, right? We think about the fact that communities historically, and generationally, we hold that trauma. We hold that trauma in our bodies. We hold that trauma in our hearts. We hold that trauma in our brains. It's cellular, right? And so it's really thinking about that and keeping that really present when we're working with folks, right? What does it mean to work with folks that have experienced the violence of slavery, right? What does it mean to work with folks that have experienced the violence of racism, right? Of xenophobia? What does it mean, right? To work with folks that have experienced the loss of their lands because they have been stolen and taken away from them, and they have seen their lands desecrated and violated, right? Like all of those things are things that we hold in our cellular system and that are with us, right? We carry that. And so when we're working with participants, if it impacts us, it also impacts our participants because this impacts our communities and we're part of those communities. And so I want to ask folks to think about what are some of the ways that trauma shows up with the folks that you work with. So when you think of your participants, when you think of the participants you work with or your colleagues, right? What are some of the ways you've have witnessed trauma show up? And you can either use your microphone if possible, or you can type it in the chat box. Yes, distrust of institutions. Absolutely, Caleb, I hope I'm pronouncing, I was gonna say Caleb, like we say in Spanish, but I think it's Caleb, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Distrust of institutions, right? Crying when triggered in conversations, absolutely. Sometimes it's like, it just comes out and it's like, where I was just asking this question about this thing and the person just like had an emotional reaction to that. Misdirected anger, right? Sometimes we represent those structures, and folks, sometimes if they trust us, they will, that anger and that frustration, we're being asked to hold it for them, right? And sometimes it shows up as extreme emotional reactions that don't fit the situation, right? So the reaction is not commensurable to what we are, to what the event is, right? And that should tell us that is probably a trauma response. For some folks, we manage trauma through substance use, right? Through substance use, trauma causes grief. It also leads us to isolate. So it moves us to isolation. Other folks are sharing that trauma shows up with the folks that she's working with distress, anxiety, depression, health problems, sometimes alcoholism. Davin is saying lack of resources, absolutely. And so for some folks, it's being unable to show up and do the things that we feel pleasure and happiness and to like produce, to feel that we can show up in the way and contribute to it, right? For some of us, it's about, engaging in self-harm or shutting out people. So we become we don't trust folks. So we like keep those cards really close to our chest. And it also shows up in how we relate to each other or we cannot relate to one another, right? So in relationship with, it impacts. Trauma impacts the way that we can build relationships, that we can sustain relationships, or even the way we feel we can show up and engage in relationships. Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts around that. So when we're thinking about trauma and how can trauma affect people, and we're working with participants and we're thinking of conflict management and de-escalation, it's really important for us to ask ourselves these questions, right? So when I'm seeing my participant, so that I'm aware of what's happening, what are some of the physical reactions to trauma, right? What are some of the ways that physically trauma can show up for someone, right? Whether it's like standing up and leaving a room, right? Whether it's like, doing this thing, I don't know how you say that, cracking your knuckles, is that how you say it? Like I had a participant whenever something, it's like she would crack her knuckles, right? For some other people, it's like unable to sit still. For some other folks, a physical reaction to trauma is completely shutting down their body, right? So thinking about how what are some of those physical reactions? Yelling and shaking, absolutely. Those are some physical reactions to trauma. And then thinking about, when we hear those escalated tones of voice, right? When people are crying, that's a physical reaction to trauma. That is something that is giving us a cue that something's happening there. What are some of those emotional reactions to trauma, right? What are some of the ways that trauma impacts the way that we connect to our emotions, right? So for some folks, maybe agitation. For some folks, maybe anger. For some folks, maybe crying, right? For some folks, maybe complete dissociation and distancing, right? So thinking about what are those emotional reactions to trauma and how those may impact a situation of conflict to escalate it, right? And finally, what are some of the ways that trauma can impact someone's ability to engage in services? So I don't want to talk about that, right? That's an impact that impacts the way that we can engage in services because I am not willing to go down that path, right? And I may need to go down that path to engage in services, right? So if I shut down and I've withdrawn, if I miss appointments, right? If I don't feel I can adhere to my medication, right? Or I'm having trouble adhering to medication, absolutely. For some other folks, it has to do with inability to eat or sleep well, right? And that then creates issues for that person or makes it more difficult for the person to engage in services. Absolutely. All of those things are ways in which trauma can impact someone's ability to engage in services, right? And so it's for us to start thinking about that. And I'm sure you're already thinking about this, but to keep it in the forefront of our minds when we're thinking of conflict management and de-escalation, right? So if you can think of what are some of the experiences of trauma that you have witnessed or because they've shared this with you, your participants have experienced, like what are some of the things that your participants have shared in regards to their own experiences of trauma? Thank you, Manuela. Mistrust in the healthcare system, right? And we are part of the healthcare system sometimes, so that makes it really challenging, but it's also good to know, right? It's good for us to know that those experiences have happened because then we know not only where we stand, but also we can ask, like, how can we be different? What are the things that you need from me so that I can make this space be a space that feels safe to you, right? What are the things that I need to keep in mind so that I'm not repeating those patterns, right? And the only way that you can trust me is by me showing you that you can trust me in a sustained, continuous way, right? So absolutely. For some of other folks are sharing in the chat box that folks, their participants they work with engage in substance use or misuse of substances, poor dieting or eating in ways that is not necessarily the best for their bodies. Folks that have lack of access to housing. For some folks is childhood fears that are resurfacing in adulthood. For some folks is engaging or living in situations of intimate partner violence, right? Not having family support or being engaged in the carceral system, right? In a way that it's cyclical. Someone is sharing, that they've had Black men share how the military has been really incredibly damaging and traumatic. Their experience of being in the military, right? And like the impact of that in their lives. And someone else is sharing that for some folks, the way that trauma shows up is by repeated emergency room or hospital visits, right? So all of those things, thank you, are really great examples of, of the ways that trauma shows up for our participants. And and how it, you know, it also is important for us to know those things so that we are aware of them and we can begin conversations with them about that. Yes, Savannah.
I love how you saw me go off mute. I was just going to say, I love in seeing this list how y'all are really pointing out both like incidents of specific trauma as well as structural patterns of trauma and how those things play together for people often, and that they're both examples of trauma and that they're not separate.
Absolutely, yes. Trauma is systemic, and systems are set up to be traumatic, right? And so when you are engaging in any of these systems and you are someone whose identities intersect in ways in which society shames you and stigmatizes you and creates spaces for you to feel disempowered, then certainly trauma will be present. Someone is sharing that a traumatic experience for one of their participants was being involved or in the foster youth system as well. Thank you for sharing that. And so now I want us to think about what conflict is. What is conflict? You're in an office and you see something, you're like, damn, that's conflict. So what is conflict? Tension. Yes. You can feel it, right? It's like your spidey sense. Disagreement. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Discomfort. Yeah, conflict. Normally we don't think, oh, conflict is fun. For someone, it can be an offense. Yes. It's a misunderstanding. It can stem from a misunderstanding. Absolutely. Yes. We're both thinking we're on the same page, but we're not, right? And so then we are showing up to communication with different understandings and different desires and needs. Absolutely. You don't see it my way, right? So if you don't see it my way, then that means that, you know, I'm not feeling seen and heard and understood, right? And that can lead to conflict. Absolutely. Anything else? Someone has thrown you under the bus. Absolutely, yes. That can lead to conflict. That can feel to us that is hard, and that makes us feel seen, unseen, and unheard, right? Absolutely, as well. When we feel that we've been thrown under the bus, right? Somebody has violated our trust, right? Somebody that we trusted has, in some ways, violated that trust that we have put in that person. So, as well as, you know, someone is sharing here, feeling like you're not being heard and isolation can also lead to conflict, right? And so, when we think of conflict, I want to offer this. Conflict is a disagreement in which those involved see a threat to their needs being met or their concerns not being addressed, right? And so here we can see how some of those things that you were sharing in the chat box are showing up, right? Conflict is a key element. A key element of conflict, right, is the idea that each person may have a different perception of any given situation, right? So what someone was saying, you're not seeing it my way, right? Or like, we are coming to this, let's say I have this bottle here, right? So someone says, oh, like that was for you to give to someone, and I was going to give that to someone. I'm like, no, but it's mine, right? And so here we are, we're both interested in the bottle, but we want different things with it, right? And so you have a different perspective or perception of the situation. And conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum. When we are in conflict, we bring our full selves to that conflict, right? We bring who we are, how we respond, our own traumatic experiences, right? Like who we are in the world, our moods, our perceptions, our feelings. You know, like I have a colleague, her name is Sandra Houston, and she works with us at Harm Reduction Coalition, at the National Harm Reduction Coalition, to help us communicate better. And one of the things that she's teaching us is it's conversational intelligence, right? And so what she says to us is like, there's stories that we tell ourselves, right? What is the story that I'm telling myself here? Because depending on the story that I'm telling myself here, I may be showing up in a certain way to that conversation, right? I may show escalated, I may show up angry, I may show up frustrated, right? I would love to chat more about our conversational intelligence webinar, and that's something to keep in mind for folks to think about in the future. Absolutely. And I can share some of those resources as well, because we found it really useful, right? And it's a muscle. You know, this stuff is like working, we're building our muscles, and we're here for the long term. So this is like a marathon, and I'm making a lot of analogies around gyms, and I'm not the more gymmy kind of person, but It is. It's like we are building these muscles and we have to practice. And this practice requires us also to be vulnerable, right? And to really do a lot of soul searching, really look at ourselves and see what are the things that trigger us, what are the things that come up for us so that we're aware of them. So we can be mindful if they show up or when they're going to show up in a situation, because that means that I may not be the best person to handle that situation in that moment. Maybe I need to say, hey, Vanny, I need you to step in here because I know I'm not going to be effective because I am feeling my whoosh response, which is my amygdala, sort of perking up, and I'm getting angry, I'm frustrated, and I am not going to be a good person to navigate the situation, right? So absolutely, it's thinking about who we are, where we are, and what we bring to that situation, right? And we cannot talk about conflict without bringing it together and joining it and thinking about the role that trauma plays, right? And so here are some definitions of different ways that trauma exists, that people experience trauma, right? And so we're not in a trauma training, so I'm not going to do a deep dive on these, right? But it's important to think that like trauma shows up in different ways for people, that most of the folks that at least I work with experience chronic or complex trauma, right? Which are very similar. They experience that, as well as toxic stress. And 2020 has been the year of toxic stress, if anything, for us, right? And it's bringing up a lot of stuff for me, at least, around my chronic trauma experiences, right? And that we also, not only we have our own, but we also work with people. So we're holding that secondary or vicarious trauma, right? So I am holding my own, and then I am also holding someone else's. And so it's important for us to then really think about those things, because our cup can get full really quickly, right? When we're navigating our own experiences and what this world feels for us, which is, we can come, as I said, to work in a vacuum, right? And then we're dealing with the experiences that our participants are sharing with us. So the way that trauma impacts conflict is that sometimes when we're thinking of trauma, right, we see, and I think this is beautiful because someone mentioned this in the chat box, that some folks may react to what we perceive as small things in a way that may not seem proportionate to the outside viewer, right? And there's days that I can hold that. There's days in which I am in a place where someone has this, like, I may be asking a participant a question and they start speaking really loudly and they're getting agitated, and I'm in a good place emotionally and physically to hold that, right? I can calm myself down. I can immediately think, I care about this participant. This is not about me, Tanagra. This is a reaction that most likely stemming from trauma, right? Let me center myself and be my mindfulness so that I can then ask some questions and be able to understand better what's happening, right? That's me on my best day. And let me tell you, there's Tanagra days that are not so great, right? And there's days when that participant is screaming at me and my own stuff is like coming up, and then all of a sudden my amygdala gets triggered, right? I get triggered. I'm like, why is this person screaming at me? Like, I was just asking a question, like, who are they? Who dare they do this stuff? And all of a sudden I'm telling myself a different story, right? And I'm unable to listen. I am unable to be open, right? I'm unable to hold that. So it's really, really important then, because then I can escalate that. I can escalate that situation just by, why are you screaming? I just asked you for this little thing. Why are you reacting that way? And I can immediately put that person in the defensive, right? So that's also important for us to keep in mind, the impact that trauma has in situations, particularly when we're navigating conflict with folks. So now we're gonna do a breakout group exercise. How many of you have done breakout group exercises before? Have you used the Zoom rooms? Yes, you're familiar with them? Okay, so I'm not gonna bore you too much with this. But what we're gonna do is the following. You are going to get, Jacqueline has very kindly offered to both paste the questions in the chat box, but she's also going to share with you a link to a Google document that has those questions. So you'll have access to both in two different ways to the questions. And you're going to go into your breakout groups for 15 minutes. So you'll get to meet some new folks. I want to really encourage you strongly to turn on your camera so folks can see your faces. And I want you to just think and chat with each other about these questions, right? What are situations that can cause conflict, particularly in the workplace? what are some examples of conflict that you're already seeing come up in your organization, right? And you can give one example of that. I give you plenty of conflicts that we've had to deal with in HRC. And then finally, what does it mean when a situation is escalating? And this may be different for some of us, right? What does it look, feel, and sound like for you? What an escalated situation in my Puerto Rican, Cuban, Mexican family looks like. To the outsider, they think we're escalating and we're just chatting, right? And then inside my house, I'm like, oh, we're not fighting, we're just talking because we're really loud. and for other folks, that's their own situation of like what feels like escalated is different, right? So the way that I navigate a situation that escalated through my lens will be different than Savannah's, for example. And so we are going to break into those groups. You will be there for 15 minutes. I would love to ask a volunteer to share what are some of the situations that can cause conflict? What are some of the things that you talked about in your group that you identified as situations that can cause conflict in those spaces? And you can use your microphone. Hi.
Hi, this is Padma Magdala. I was in this beautiful room 12, with Raquel, Nora, and Neftali. Some common situations we figured were conflict-laden or led to escalating situations were, housing and the wait times and with folks having to deal with remote work. Therefore, also contributing to the wait times for the clients was one of the situations. Others was just again providing housing, to the vulnerable and at-risk populations now, especially at the time of COVID. That would lead into a bit of a riffraff if they had to move around a little bit, maybe. And one interesting point I noted from one of the participants in room 12 was she's essentially new to her job. So in this environment and with the clients that she would work with, the task that she has to bear in mind is to earn their trust. Mm-hmm. And it is a population that just wouldn't easily, you don't get the buy-in. So it was just very informative. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for that recap of what you spoke in your group, right? And I think something that resonated for me from what you shared is the added layer of stress that like this pandemic has. It's, for all of us, right, that we're holding that, and also for our participants, right, that the folks that we work with, and how threatening this can feel, and how feeling threatened can also, lead us to show up in situations with being less spacious and feeling less centered and less coming from a place of trust, absolutely. And also the urgency around some of these services that are life-saving services for folks, and sometimes those feeling that you have to wait for something that can make a difference in your life can be really challenging, and can lead to folks feeling also, on top of that sense of like being threatened, also lead to that escalation. Absolutely. I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask folks if I could have one volunteer from a group to share. When you spoke about conflict or thinking about a situation escalating, what did you talk about in terms of what it looks, feels, and sounds like for you all? Can someone share what you all talked about? Yes. You can unmute yourselves.
Okay. Yes. Hi. So we talked about like what you were mentioning, that for some people gesticulating a lot and they're very exaggerating the way they actually express thoughts and feelings, but might be normal in their culture, but for other cultures it's not, and it can come across as offensive or more violent. So it really depends, and we need to be mindful of that. And again, not taking things personal, because again, we're all very different. So the importance of working in a diverse place with diverse folks, so we can learn more from each other.
Absolutely right. Thank you for that. And what would be a way that we can engage? Yeah, Marcel, what would be a way, I see you, a way that we can engage folks to sort of get more clarity around that, right? Like, how can we get more clarity around how is that person responding, and what does that have to do with the place that they're from, with like their culture, with the sense of identity, right? So that we're not assuming, right, making assumptions about people's behavior, but we're seeking clarification, right, for folks. Thank you for that. Marcel, you wanted to share?
Yeah, one of the things I brought to the group, what it means when a situation is, what does it mean when a situation is escalating, is I think it's outside the ability to control it in normal, good conversation, understanding. And as you see that, you see the anger. The people in my group are all service providers, so dealing with guests, whether they were homeless, whether they are in need of assistance in other areas, and it could stimulate something from not having a mail package that they wanted today, or not being able to sleep in the cot that they're normally, used to sleeping in. And so trying to have a typical dialogue, you see it escalating where it's something where civil courts can't handle it. And now it's leading towards screaming, kicking, throwing, or, even at times violence. And so that's what we thought about as a situation that was escalating outside of, the normal ability to control it.
Thank you for sharing that, Marcel. I think that one of the things that sometimes I have found really useful when engaging with folks that have come up to my space, to the space that I was working at, and I've had to, sometimes you have to say no to folks, right? Like, I had someone come in and they were told that we were going to give them housing that day. Like, they can put you in an apartment. And the person came in, this was a woman, a female identified person, she identifies a woman, who was a parent, who was in the process of being evicted from her home. And she was really terrified that she was going to lose her children because she was afraid CPS would intervene, right? In Puerto Rico, Child Protective Services. And so when she came, it was like 3:00 in the afternoon. I could see that she had been pushed, like a ping pong, and for all these different directions. And she's like, she told me this, like, you can't give me housing here, right? And I asked her to come in. I said, hey, come on, why don't you come in? Let me just get a little bit more information about, like, tell me a little bit more about, how do you come to us? Like, who told you to come here? Like, I just want to get a sense to see if I can help you, or what I can do to help, right? And I said, can I give you some water? Can I offer you a coffee? We used to have coffee all the time. And so, we started a conversation, and I, said to her, I'm really, I want to apologize in advance because, we are not someone who can give you housing right in this moment. And there are things that I can do to support you, to be able to figure out a way in which you can be placed in some temporary shelter while we figure out your housing situation. And I can do all these things for you if that's okay with you, right? So I was able to, I feel, engage in conversation with her, and she was like, oh, okay. She started crying. She's like, I'm just frustrated. And I was like, I get it. You can cry. It's frustrating. I understand completely and how difficult this is. And these are the things that I can do to help and support in this moment. And I also want to tell you what my organization does so that, you also are consensually agreeing to some of the things that I'll be offering you. And giving you housing today is not one of them. And this is why. Right? And I want you to understand. And it was a difficult conversation to have. And we were able to navigate it in a way that we could hold what she was feeling and not escalate it further, right? And in part that was because I was thinking, like, what would it be for me to show up in this space with my kid and be told this, right? And to really hold that for her, and also to think that sometimes our folks are hungry and tired and upset. And Puerto Rico's hot, and when it's hot, it's hot. And let me tell you, like, sometimes you just like are so exhausted when being pushed around all day, and just having a seat and offering someone water or something to drink makes a difference in terms of, like, helping to create a situation where the person's defenses are not as front and forward as they may be in other contexts, right? And I think that we are all trying also as providers to do our best in really difficult circumstances, and our stress levels are 1,000% high because of the realities that we're living under. So I just think that, giving ourselves that space of grace also is really important too. And I really appreciate you all for sharing with each other in the small groups, and also with sharing with us here in this space. And now I want us to move into really thinking about what escalation is. And so the way that we define escalation is a rapid increase or rise in emotions, usually in a negative context, right? And so what we see is like escalation happens, there's different phases in terms of escalation. All those phases, it will look different in different situations, but it's to understand that there's a phase of escalation, an explosion phase, and then the post-explosion phase, right? And when we are thinking of these stages of escalation, to start sort of figuring out where our participants may be, right? So thinking about the stage where there's anxiousness, right? Where there's a trigger, somebody gives you a dirty look, somebody said the movement, right? The increased psychomotor activity. Sometimes our participants like get up, like suddenly, or they're like sitting down and they're moving forward, their body language changes. I told you about the participant that used to do the cracking of her knuckles. I could tell that she was getting anxious, right? And there's other cues for us to also pick out in terms of that anxiousness, right? And then there's the belligerent state, right? So that's where we not only see the increased psychomotor ability, but we see the volume getting the octaves are getting higher, right? So we can get the voices rising, right? And for some folks, the increased use of profanity also shows up, right? Sometimes it's like, it's no longer like, giving you a dirty look, but like calling you something, right? Like saying, mira, so-and-so. I'm not going to use the language here, but you all know, right? And then there's the phase of aggression, right? Which is slamming objects, slamming a door, right? The actual use of violence in some cases for folks, like pushing or punching or throwing something at someone. And then there's the extreme danger, right? Which is the use of a weapon or something, an implement to create harm for folks, right? And when I think of my experiences with escalation, usually I have found myself in anxiousness, belligerence, and aggression. Thankfully, I have never been in a situation of extreme danger, right? And I have also prepared myself for that because it can happen, right? And so it's important to have a conversation organizationally about what would that look like and how we would handle that if that came to happen to one of us, right? And so we have the escalation phase. We know what escalation looks like. We can see where the triggers are, right? And then it's about figuring out how do we de-escalate, right? What are some of the things that we can do to de-escalate? And the first thing is to understand actually what de-escalation is. De-escalation is a technique that we can use during a potential conflicting situation, a situation of conflict, in an attempt to give the person space to express and process their emotions in a safe way, to reduce the chances of them causing harm to themselves or to us or to others, right? So this is a technique that we use where we get folks to feel safe expressing, and processing their emotions. So that way we can reduce the chances of them exploding or going from that belligerent to that stage of aggression, right? So when we think of de-escalation is not a teaching opportunity, although for some folks it's an opportunity to learn. And that means for me as a provider, it's an opportunity to learn. And it may be an opportunity to learn for the participants. It's not dealing with a nuisance. And it's not something that you will only ever have to do once, right? Many a times, maybe twice, like twice a day, we had to de-escalate situations. In a good week, sometimes we had to de-escalate every day, multiple times a day, right? So it's not something that we have to do once. So it's, I feel it's important for us to have conversations with our team as to what that looks like for us and how do we support each other when we have to engage in de-escalation, right? With participants. And so part of being able to intervene effectively in a crisis situation is to help the participant in this phase, in the escalation phase, right? Immediately there, so that we are decreasing that sense of anxiety, fear, and panic, right? So once they move to that explosion phase or post-explosion phase, it may be more difficult to de-escalate the situation, right? So if we can be mindful of like, what are the things that are triggers that we're noticing for folks, and how the situation is becoming escalated, to engage in this particular stage would be really important. Yes, let the individual know that you're truly listening. Thank you, Eddie. And how do we do that? How do we show folks that we're truly listening in that moment where we are also And we're also dealing with our own stuff, right? In that moment of escalation. So how do you do that? What are some of the things that can be cues to someone that we are truly listening to them? Because I feel that that's a really important point that you bring. Repeat what they're saying, reflective listening. What I hear you saying is making eye contact, nodding my head, using body language, right? Showing that I'm present, right? Without really being overbearing. Showing empathy, right? Like being able to acknowledge, you know, like what I hear you telling me that this is really hard or frustrating, or you're pissed off or angry or tired, right? Validating those feelings, right? Acknowledging the feedback that you're understanding and not interrupting. Absolutely. It's making sure that we're letting that person process their emotions, and sometimes that will look like a monologue, and it's okay. They're not asking for a feedback. What we're trying to create is a space that is safe for folks to unpack those emotions, right? And that we feel that we can hold that space for people. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Those are really fantastic examples of active listening, right? Which is key in this particular situation, and it's part of that conversational intelligence that I was sharing before, right? It's how we're showing up. And when we de-escalate, we have to be mindful of its relationship to power, right? There's always power dynamics in situations, and particularly as providers, whether we like it or not, we hold power, right? We hold power because we have access to resources people need, because we have information that can make a difference for someone, and because we're getting paid to do this work, right? And so in that sense, that puts us in a different situation than our participants. So understanding those power dynamics can help us then, and being aware of that can help us navigate the escalation situations better, right? And to think about, you know, the fact that when a situation gets escalated, there's a fear for participants that they may not be able to receive those services again, right? Like if I explode here, I may get kicked out, because that's what happened maybe in other settings, right? As someone was saying, right? When I am expressing my anger or my frustration, right? Or my trauma gets triggered in a way, you know, that feels that I'm escalated, then I may get kicked out, right, of the program. So it's that adds more to the situation, right? And it potentially escalates it even further, right? So it's really thinking about what is our role and how can we as providers use our power, right, to acknowledge it, but also to use our power in a way that we can look at the ways in which we're handling situations that are escalated in a way where we're not punishing participants, but being really clear about boundaries and practicing these escalation techniques with each other, so that we can then, you know, when we have to show up to a situation, we feel we have the tools that we need, right? So it's showing that compassion, right? Showing compassion, showing, you know, I can feel compassion for someone and care for someone and still be, and still feel upset, right? Those two things can be true. And at that moment as a provider, the most important thing is for me to make sure that both people are safe, right? So thank you for that, absolutely. There's also, power doesn't show up necessarily only for us being providers, right? There's tons of other, or a myriad of power dynamics that are rooted in oppression, marginalization, and stigma that can play a part in an interaction, right? Something called race, ethnicity, and nationality, right? Stigma related to drug use, to being unhoused, or to mental health conditions. Gender and presentation and sexuality, and then poverty and access to resources, right? So when we think of situations, sometimes I am not the best person as a non-Black person of color, as a ambiguous passing Latina. I may not be the best person to navigate a certain situation, right? I know that my presence is what is escalating it. So I need to be humble and be like, you know what? I want to be able to support you, and I don't think I'm the right person to do that in this moment, but if you allow me, I can connect with my colleague who may be able to do that. Or who do you want to work with? It's not me, fine. Who would you like to connect to in this moment, right? To make sure that we are aware of that, right? Like what I bring as a cisgender woman, right, who is very much like passing as a woman. What does that mean, right? What does it mean that, like, you know, when folks see me, they don't immediately think of someone that uses drugs, right? What kind of privilege does that, you know, allow me to be able to hold and move through the world with? And how is that different for someone that may not necessarily be perceived that way? And what does that mean in terms of escalation and power in our participants, right? Absolutely thinking about those things and talking about those things, if we feel that there's enough safety in our conversations with participants, can be really useful, so that we can understand then how those dynamics can show up in situations when we're working with folks. And now I want us to move to some strategies for de-escalation, right? So this is the piece when we actually get to take some of the stuff that we have been talking about and figure out how to approach it, right? And so there's several strategies for de-escalation. The first one I want to share that I think folks are already shared in the, you all know about this stuff, right? So you already are doing the work and you understand it, is to establish connection and rapport building, right? So make sure that we're approaching folks with a warm, caring, and genuine tone, right? A lot of the times, folks have been treated so, folks expect us to treat them poorly. That is so sad for me to say, but our folks sometimes are so battered by the systems that they expect to be treated like caca, you know what I mean? And so I think a difference that we can make is to say to someone, hey, hi, how are you? How can I help you, right? I remember a participant that I hadn't seen in years and come back, and I remember the name, right? And I was like, hey, how are you, so-and-so? And they were like, oh my God, you remember my name? And I'm like, of course I remember your name. And I'm so glad to see you. How are you, right? So that is really important. And what's warm and genuine and caring for me will look different to someone. So it's not about mimicking that. It's about having it come from your own heart, right? And making sure that we're offering that to that person. Clear and appropriate greeting with name, right? Whatever name they give us, that's the name we want to use. Using plain, simple, direct language is also important, and making sure that someone was saying to stay connected and engaged in the present moment, right? Because, you know, if folks don't see us connected, someone was saying one of the things that triggers trauma, it is feeling not seen and heard, right? So making sure that folks know that we're there in that moment with them, that we're giving them our undivided attention, that we're actively listening, and to avoid rushing the participant and give them the time and space to respond to what you're saying, right? So that's really, really important, right? So if the person is, for example, feeling that they have to unload on you, to make sure or they're sharing a grievance, right? They're telling you how they feel. If they're frustrated, why? To make sure that we give space for that to happen, right? So we're sure that we're able to create that space and we let them share that with us, because if they feel rushed, that it's only going to, I would say, perpetuate that notion, right? That they are not important, and that can then get someone feeling more frustrated, right? So that's really important. If we can, and if we don't have the time, I can always say to someone, you know what, I feel that what you're sharing is really important, and I want to be really present to be able to listen and to be in community with you. And would you give me 20 minutes so I can wrap this up and I can come back and have that conversation with you today, because I feel it's important. Would that be okay? Or would you give me a moment so I can tell someone to meet with this other person while I come back and sit with you, right? So you can always ask for that permission. If you feel it's really urgent to have it in that moment, I feel it's important to then make the adjustments that we need to make to hold that space. But to always be clear and transparent with folks, as well, so that they're not feeling that we're in our head sticking the minutes so we can go somewhere else to deal with another situation. Things that are relationship builders. So asking questions to show you care, right? So, tell me a little bit, could you tell me more about that? Or, you've shared that you have been feeling really angry and frustrated with the situation or your housing. Could you tell me more about what's making it feel frustrating, right? What has happened recently in this past couple of weeks, so that I can know more about it or understand better, right? Giving folks compliments as well, particularly, if it should be genuine, right? People know when you're giving them fake compliments, and I know I've gotten them, and I'm like, that doesn't feel so good, right? So it's like, oh my God. So it's if you're really happy to see someone, or if you think someone is sharing something with you and you feel really excited for them, give them that compliment, right? Smiling or giving water to someone, or just asking them, would they like to have a seed? Would they like to have a snack? Things. And remembering names and details of people. Those are all relationship builders. And things that are relationship destroyers are criticism, defensiveness, especially in protecting dogmatic rules, right? So let's say there's someone is distraught and they have to talk to someone on the phone, and they're using the phone in your drop-in center and they're being a little loud, right? And you need to have quiet. Maybe it's not a moment to be really dogmatic about that rule. Maybe it is about letting them have that conversation, and once they hang up, to ask them, hey, would you like more privacy? I'm happy to like set you up in this space here where you can talk in your phone and feel more comfortable, right? Stonewalling, which is refusing to talk or repeated mistreatment, right? There's a crisis, a situation, or something's happening and that person feels you're avoiding them. And contempt, which is usually through body language, but it can be like looks, which is part of body language, right? It's like attitude. It's like, like, I don't want to deal with you, right? Those are all relationship destroyers, right? So it's really thinking about how can we build on those relationship builders and be mindful of when we engage in those relationship destroyers, right? So we avoid them. And as a service provider, important things for us to keep in mind that are part of those relationship builders is not to make assumptions about mental health or substance use, right? Like I just don't know. And because I don't know, I am not going to make assumptions, right? It's important for us, if we need to seek clarification, to ask, and ask with genuine curiosity, caring curiosity, as my colleague Emma says, because it makes sense for us to ask as part of the process in which we are engaging the person, right? Because that information will be helpful to us to be able to refer them or connect them to other services. Treating clients with respect, so speaking clearly and calmly, and when possible, take them to a private space. I used to have a participant, she used to come in, and like when she came, every time she came through the door, she would start just talking about her stuff and everybody could hear, right? And I wanted to protect her so that people, she was like telling me all this stuff. And I was saying, hey, why don't let's go to the back room and we can have a cup of coffee and you can tell me more. Right. And so I would bring her into we would go into this little room we had in the back that had this nice window and we could have a coffee. Right. And that was our ritual. Right. And that way she could have privacy. Right. And share her thoughts, her feelings, her ideas with me, what was going on. And other people didn't have to hear that. Right. Employing empathy. So avoiding being cruel. And I think when we're experiencing trauma and compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and stress and burnout and all that stuff, I know I have been cruel, right? And that doesn't feel good to me and it doesn't feel good to the participants. So really trying to employ empathy and really trying to put myself in that person's experience. And if I don't know how to do that, to ask questions that can help me see, that can help me understand. Know our own organizational boundaries and know our own boundaries, right? And set them kindly but firmly. Right. So if I think important things that we should do is to, if we know those boundaries, to make sure that we are constantly or very frequently when we're working with participants, letting participants know that those boundaries are there and like refreshing and going over them so that folks are aware and so that we can have a conversation with folks about it. Right. So if you have a boundary, for example, that folks should they have to come once a month to an appointment, for example, and someone has missed them, to just check in with them and say, hey, I just wanted to kind of check in with you about our meetings and just like think about, like why I feel they're important for me, and to also assess what's going on, like what's happening and how maybe we can figure out a different way to connect. And this is the reason why we have to have these meetings, right? So you're giving people information, you're explaining to them why, and you're giving them or explaining the boundaries and why those boundaries exist, so that folks are operating with all the information that they need to have, right? They're not operating in a vacuum or without the knowledge. And finally, to take a moment to understand what the source of the conflict is, right? So it may be that people are feeling upset because, or there's a conflict around them feeling that they can access the services that they need, or it's taken too long, or, we refer them somewhere and they're creating more boundaries for them to access the services, right? So it has not to do necessarily with us, but with us referring them somewhere else, right, where we don't control the process. And sometimes I realize that I may not necessarily have explained correctly what the process in that other place will look like, and the person has been going in blind, and so then they're surprised because they didn't know what to expect. right? So I realized quickly that one of the things I could do was ask someone and say, hey, I will be referring you to this new place. Would it be helpful for me to share with you what are some of the expectations, right? In this detox, you cannot smoke, right? Like this is the job for detoxes. So if they catch you smoking, they will kick you out. And someone can tell you, hey, you know what? That's not the detox for me because I am not willing to not smoke, right? I get it. Like that's the thing that like kept me sane for many years, right? So thinking about that, like giving people, you know, understanding where their source of conflict is coming from. And sometimes it is because, you know, there's things that we can do to change it if we know where it's coming from, right? So being mindful of that as well. And now, when we think of this, 10% of what we say to people, 10% is the words. 55% is the body language. And 35% is the tone of voice, right? So if I am someone who sees someone who's getting agitated, right? How should I approach that person, right? It doesn't matter what I'm saying. 10% is the words. The rest is this and the tone that I use, right? How I use the tone. Because if I start screaming too, what will happen? If you scream and I scream, we all scream, and then everybody's getting agitated, it's not good, right? So it doesn't matter if what I'm saying, even if I'm screaming and I'm saying, but I'm here to support you and I care about you. If I'm screaming, they're not listening because all they're hearing is a screaming, right? If I'm doing it in this way that feels really threatening with my body, it's conflict, absolutely. So it's being really mindful of this. It's like our body language and our tone of voice, right? And I know that when I'm getting trauma responses, my body language changes, right? Like I need to be mindful of that so that I'm not closing it or becoming threatening to someone. So that's really important. I know my tone of voice. Oh, absolutely, yes. My tone of voice, sometimes I have to think of like when I get agitated, I speak really fast and I can get louder. So part of what I need to do is if I'm feeling myself that my breathing is shortening and I feel my gut tensing, all those are my trauma reactions. I feel my body's closing in. That's the exercise. And sometimes my colleagues, I had a friend who I work really closely and she used to tell me, Melgarejo, your shoulders are in your ears. And that was her cue. Like I had asked her because that was her cue to tell me that she was noticing that my amygdala was about to like, you know, that I was feeling a reaction, right? That I was not necessarily centered and mindful. And that was helpful because that way I could say, oh, okay, you're right. Yeah, let me get back into my body. Let me breathe, right? Let me make sure that I am aware of my body and my body language. And it takes a lot of practice. And sometimes sometimes, you know, we do the best that we can, and the best that we can is not, it will never be perfect, right? And that's okay too. Meaning, you know, we can only try to do our best. And we have to trust that we have other folks around us to support us too, right? And that we have built relationships where we can have that feedback from them to be able to practice some of these things in a way that feels safe. So if you think about a personal crisis that you faced, right? This is your own, you don't have to share it. I want you to close your eyes for a minute and think about a personal crisis that you faced, something. So what did you feel during that experience? And what did you want from others? That's the most important piece, right? Like, what did you want from others? And what helped you deal with the crisis, right? So think about that for a second. And really think about what would have been helpful from what did you want for others? What would that thing that the other person could give you could have made it better and helped you deal with the crisis? So if I can have one or two volunteers share, like in a personal crisis, we don't need to know the crisis, but like, what did you want? Like if you were facing that personal crisis, what did you want from others in that moment? And what helped you deal with the crisis? Yes. See, Manuela.
I think that for the other person to remain calm and offer comfort, like genuine comfort.
And can I ask you, can you tell me how would that look like to you, genuine comfort? Like, how would you know it feels like?
Empathy in words, empathy in gestures, and inappropriate physical contact.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Absolutely. So feeling listened, feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling understood, right? What else? Can I have another, thank you, Manuela. Can I have another volunteer share? What did you want from that other person or others, and what helped you deal with the crisis? And you can unmute yourself if you'd like. Eddie's sharing that not feeling in control. Yes, absolutely. And when sometimes we don't feel in control, that it feels like we're in this crisis, right? And we want to have space, right? Like we have space. We want to be like in that first moment, maybe just to be like, I want to be with me to understand what's happening. And then sometimes we want some physical touch. We want some affection, right? We want someone to be there, right? And as Manuela was sharing, to like hold space with us, right? And that can look different in different ways, right? Holding space for someone is sometimes for me has been to sit next to someone and just to let me bawl my eyes out and cry, ugly cry, do what I need to do, right? And just be there with me. Other times, right? It can mean that like, I want that person to listen and to tell me that yes, you're not making it up. This is really, really hard. It is hard, right? It is hard. I hear you. It is hard. And it's okay to feel that what you're feeling, right? Sometimes I want someone to validate my feelings for me because my own trauma experience has led me not to trust my feelings, right? And so thinking about, what it is that we need in a crisis and what has helped, right? And to be able to show folks that my emotions are not personal towards them, right? Like what you're holding space for me, but this is not about you. This is about me in this moment. And if I'm venting, right, it's not because I'm angry at you. It's because this is how I need the emotional space to be able to process those feelings, right? To process those emotions. So you think about this. What we want sometimes out of folks around us when we're navigating personal crisis is not different at all that when our participants are asking us or asking from us, right? Sometimes what a participant needs and wants is someone to hold space for them, right? To like tell them that someone else sees them and understands that they're not like this system is set up to gaslight us, right? That's part of the harm. Right? Tell someone, no, yeah, I hear you. I see what you're telling me. Yes, I understand. It's real, it's happening, and it's screwed up, and it's up, and it's harmful. And I see that happening, and I hold your anger with you, and I hold it in this space of safety for you and with you, right? Because, it makes you go crazy. The system makes you feel like you're losing your marbles, right? And so what we want from others is comfort, is to be listened, to be seen, to be heard. And what has helped us deal with that crisis is to know that we're not alone, right? That we have someone next to us in that moment, and that person that can show up also afterwards. I may not need you in this moment, but I may want to have you support me a little bit later, right? So know that I have that support system to be there for me, right? And so when we're thinking of conflict management, some of the things that can be helpful for us as providers while we understand and we hold space for people is SPLAT, which is a funny acronym. It's like, I'm like, I don't know if that's the best acronym, it's like kind of funny, which has to do with like, the acronym stands for self-control, prevent, listen, adapt, and think. And we're gonna go through each of these, right? So when we're thinking of conflict management, the first piece of SPLAT is that self-control, right? So down here in the bottom of the pyramid is us, right? I am only able to control myself, right? I can control my emotions and my responses and the way that I show up, as we were saying before. So it's really important to be mindful of like, how am I showing up? What is happening to me that day, right? And then that physical presence, taking a supportive stance, right? So for example, one of the things that I learned really quickly was not to crowd people's faces, not to stand over them, but usually like to go down. If they're sitting down, to ask if I can sit next to you. If someone's standing, not to block their path, right? To like talk to them in a way where you're still having eye contact and your body language is open, but that they can leave if they have to, so they don't feel cornered, because that can also triggers people's trauma responses. Just really think about that physical presence and taking that supportive stance, right? Like not to be like with my hombros to my ears, right? Like that, it's like immediately I'm closing myself off, right? Like, and finally, it's like the conversation strategies we use, right? Like how do we ask questions, right? How do we, our tone of voice, what is it convey? How is it that we can create space for the conversation to happen so that the person can share with us, so we're creating the container so the person feels safe to share with us what's happening in that moment for them, right? So that's part of that self-control. And then the other piece of that SPLAT is the prevent piece, right? So things that we can do to prevent conflict from happening, right, or try to, is to be clear on community guidelines, right? So this is super important. So not only like place them somewhere people can see them, but talk about them and make sure that we're communicating them and that folks can understand them. And to make sure that we're really we're really understanding them and that they are understanding them. Right now, we're in a process inside of NHRC where we're launching this project, and we thought people understood the project, and we've realized that 90% of staff doesn't understand it. So we're launching a project that people don't understand what it is about, right? So talk about like, we have to go back to those community guidelines. We have to realize that what we were communicating was not clear, people were not understanding it, and that we have to do it differently, right? So it's good that we found out early on, right? So we don't create more confusion for folks. Get feedback and community consensus at guidelines. If you have the ability to do this, I used to do this with every new cycle of participants that came to us. For every new cycle of participants, we would develop community guidelines with them and for them. So the community guidelines of participants in cycle 1 look different than community guidelines for participants in cycle 6, right? So community guidelines, some of them will overlap, or some of them are really independent to the group, right? And so creating consensus means that I am getting a buy-in from participants and that we are working together to build those guidelines and to also create the space for folks to ask questions, but also to have accountability, right? Tonight I'm accountable. I was part of those community guidelines, the development of those guidelines, and I'm accountable to them, and other people can hold me accountable, right? My team members, my colleagues, my peers, right? And make sure that we don't play favorites. This is also something that sometimes I've had participants that I said I have loved them dearly, and they challenged me a ton. And I love them dearly and challenged me a ton. And sometimes it was not a fun interaction to work with them because it was hard for me, right? And so it's easier for us to gravitate to those folks that it's easier to work with because they don't challenge us, or because they are complying, or because they're doing the things that we think they should be doing. And people see that, right? And so playing favorites will just create more conflict, right? So if there's a guideline that people should not be smoking cigarettes, it's not okay for me to go ahead and give my favorite participant a cigarette, right? And then someone else sees me and they're like, wait a minute, why did she get a cigarette and I don't get a cigarette? Why does she get to smoke with you and I don't get to smoke with you, right? And that just creates chisme, and it creates tension, and it creates more challenging situations that can create conflict. So no favorites, right? Be aware of your surroundings. So super important. We need to know what's going on, both inside and outside our work, right? To like make sure like what's happening in the building or in our office, in our space, what's happening outside. Sometimes conflict happens outside and comes inside our doors too, right? And then we have to de-escalate a conflict that has nothing to do with us as the providers, but it happened between two participants. That's something we have to do a lot of the time too, right? So de-escalating situations where we were the mediators of the situation, right? It was not about Tanaka, it was about two participants that were going at it or having like a really tense situation moment, and how we address that and make sure that everybody else is safe. And also that helps us, listening to cues of escalation, right? So what are some of those cues? Raised voices, right? We're hearing raised voices. We're seeing body language, like two people that look like they're going to fight, right? I remember clearly I had two participants that got physical scuffle, right? And I could just see from the inside of the office how both of them dropped their bags and like took this like boxing stance, which I'm not gonna try to pretend to be a boxer, right? But like I could just see them, like after that they just jumped. And then we had to like break them up, right? So I didn't react as quickly as I wanted when I saw those cues, right? But they were clear, they were there, right? And be available, right? In order to prevent conflict, we need to be available, right? To listen to people's concerns and to validate their feelings, and also to offer options and choices, right? I had a participant that came in once and said, you know, the cousin and so said that so-and-so said that I am this and this and that, and I'm pissed off at so-and-so because, you know, how dare they say that? And I said, wait a minute, hold on. Like, who said what? Like, did they tell you this directly? No, but these other people told me that they had said it. And I said, but let me ask again, have you asked them directly if that's something that they said, right? A and B, like, let's look at why that's making you feel this way, right? And it's like, oh, because it's like challenging my integrity. And I thought they knew me better and they were my friend. And I said, so you're believing that this person, you haven't heard them say it, they haven't said it to you, someone else is saying that someone said this to you. And so how can we get to the bottom of this? How can you clarify, right? Like that, would you think, like, what are some of the things that you think you can do to really figure out if, you know, this is coming from the friend, from the person? And they said, well, maybe I should ask them, like you said. And I said, would you feel comfortable doing that? How would you like to do that, right? How can we support you to do that? And so, you know, they said, well, maybe if we do it here and there's other, like, you know, if you or someone else from the staff can be like, maybe I can have that conversation, right? And we can talk. And so, you know, sometimes it's offering people choices, right? To just see that they have other avenues, that it's not necessarily, I'm going to now go and like find her. Because, you know, she was like, I'm going to find her, I'm going to beat her up. And I said, but you don't even know if this person said this to you, right? Said this about you. And I understand that, you know, when we're on the street is really important, right? Because she was like, this is like my sense of like being a stand-up person is what keeps me alive. You know, if someone challenges that, then I can get in trouble. And so I understood that concern. And also I understood that they had a relationship and a friendship with this person that could potentially be broken. And we didn't know if the person said it or not, right? And so if they said it, because they're telling you they said it, what do you want to do? And if they didn't say it, then how you can handle that, right? So it's offering folks choices and options around that and other things too. Now we have the listen piece of conflict management, right? So when we're listening, we have to try to be calm and also show that we're listening, that we're concerned, that we're present. If you don't know the person that is in the conflict situation, one of the first things that we should do is introduce ourselves, ask them their name, right? And say who we are. Another thing is if we want to talk to them, I think it's important to try to separate that person or move that person to a space where it's more private so we can really listen to what's happening, what their grievance is, what they're upset about, what is making them angry. And if we're doing that, we have to let them talk, right? So and letting them talk may mean that they may yell or scream, and we, you know, what we can do is respond in a calmer manner, right? So, you know, if that person is talking loudly, we can talk lower or like not raise our voices, but speak more calmly, right? So that then, I mean, at least when they've done it to me, when I've been agitated and a colleague has done that to me, it's been helpful because I've noticed myself immediately, like getting calmer and like lowering my voice, and like my whole system feels different, right? So letting them talk, and also when we're responding, making sure that our voice is and our demeanor is calm, so that is something that they also feel and they can mirror back to us. So that's the piece of listening. And ways that we can create a safe conversation, right? So when we're thinking of creating safe conversations, it's as Manuela said, I think someone said, these things are not as easy, right? Like these are things that we need to practice and continue to practice for the foreseeable future, right? With ourselves and with others, right? Like have self-practice sessions and also practice with others, right? So safe conversation spaces. Make sure that we're facing folks, as I was saying, and that we're eye level, right? So that we're like sure that we're like in a position where we're not threatening to them. Ask the participant if they would feel more comfortable or be or feel better about having that conversation in a more private space. Or if you can, sometimes I've asked if there's 2 participants in the drop-in center, sometimes I ask them and said, hey, you guys, can you go outside for a couple of minutes? I need to have a conversation. I'll let you know when you can come back in, right? And so make sure that like that way they feel that they're private, there's no audience. We can encourage the person to take a seat, but if they need to stand, sometimes participants are like, I'm too agitated, to sit down. Like I just need to pace. And I'm like, okay, I'll pace with you. That's fine. right? Sometimes it's like, would you like to take a seat? They're like, yes, actually, yes, I want to take a seat, right? So give people options as well, and allow enough physical space that feels comfortable between you and the participant. Sometimes, my family is very much like on top of each other. So my personal boundaries tend to be different, but this is not my family. So I always let the person sit down, and then I take the cue and I sit down here. Sometimes when I have sat, I had a participant that I loved dearly. She said, this is nothing personal. I'm just gonna move to this other seat because this feels too close. And I thought I was really distant. So I totally got that. I was like, no problem. I'm glad that you are feeling comfortable enough to do that. Like, see where you feel, take a seat wherever it feels comfortable to you, right? Make sure their hands are visible, right? And for me, in those situations, a reminder is to not use my hands as much because it can feel threatening for folks, although it's by way of showing caring and love and emotion. Make sure that my hands are calm and quiet, somewhere where they can see them, and switch out to another colleague if necessary, right? And this is a piece that it's also important. Sometimes I am the person who's triggering, or I am not the right person to hold that space for that other human. And it totally makes sense for us to say, hey, can you step in in this conversation and support me with transitioning out, because I don't think I'm the right person to handle this at this moment, right? Or I am not in the right headspace, or I am actually the person having the conflict with the participant, right? And so switching out to a colleague and letting them know that you're going to be switching out and why is also part of creating that safe space for conversation. Some strategies for de-escalation, we talked about this before, so you know this, to protect calmness, right? Make sure that when you're introducing that trusted third party, so it's someone that hopefully the participant knows, and they feel comfortable with, ask them who else would they like to come in. Sometimes they'll say, hi, can you bring Layla in? So we can bring Layla into the conversation, right? Or someone else. So that way they feel safer. Encourage the person to talk, to listen, and then we need to listen closely and be patient when we're listening, right? So make sure that, as this all stuff you said, reflecting back people's feelings, acknowledging people's emotions, make sure that we're not making any promises or making bargains. Like that's, if you come down, I'll give you this. This is not the moment to do that. Paraphrasing the situation as well. So it's mirroring back, paraphrasing, and pointing out choice points that they have, options that they may have. And this helps when you're breaking big problem into smaller problems, right? So sometimes a big problem is like, oh my God, I missed my probation day and they're coming to get me and they're gonna throw me in jail. What do I do? And the probation seems like this big problem, right? So let's just break that problem into smaller ones and see what we can accomplish. Because sometimes what becomes really overwhelming is not seeing, right? We just see this big thing and we don't see that there's potential courses of actions or choice points along the way that we can take to address it. So when I feel really overwhelmed, I find it really helpful when my colleagues or friends help me to break that big problem into a smaller one. And stay with the person, right? Make sure that we're working with that person until they have calmed down, and make sure that you take the appropriate time to address the situation. We had said this before, like we don't want to rush this. We want to make sure that people have enough time. So we're leaving the person in a better state than when they came in, right? That's what we're trying to do. We're not leaving them in a state where they're more vulnerable than when they came in. And so if anything fails, remember tacos, which is, I will always remember the tacos because I love tacos. So remember this acronym, which is better than SPLAT, although I remember SPLAT. So if your goal is to de-escalate, do not threaten the individual or contradict that individual, right? Oh, but you said this before, and now you're telling me this, right? Challenge the individual. It's like, if you don't sit down, or like you're lying, you're not being truthful or honest, right? Order or command the individual, or shame and disrespect the person, right? Like, remember tacos. Tacos are great, but tacos in this situation, not so good, right? So you don't want to have tacos here. You want to be mindful of this so you don't engage in it when working with folks. And then part of SPLAT is that adapt, right? So it is not about what people tend to need, it's about what the person needs, right? So it's like, what does that person need in that moment? This is not about 5 previous situations that you had to manage, right? Like, and they all look different and are individual. So we need to be centered on what that person needs in that moment, which is different than another participant's needs. Operate from a positive place, make sure that like the goal, what we show up with is to get the person what they need, and focus on what you can do, not what you can't, right? So give people as many options as you can, right? So that day that I couldn't give that person an apartment because I didn't have a key and that's not what we did, I said to that person, here are all the things I can do for you. I can help you with this, I can connect you with this, I can set up a call and get you into a shelter today, I can connect you to legal services if you need, like I can give you water and a snack, and I can give you a bus fare, and I can give you some snacks to take for your kids, right? So I was able to give this person all those things, right? So I focused on those that were tangible and concrete. And be flexible, right? Some of the tactics that you're using will not work for everyone, right? So for some folks, the mindful breathing may not be the thing, right? And so then we have to switch tactics and adapt. Say, okay, so maybe it is a walk, maybe it is the pacing, right? Maybe it is standing up, maybe it is going outside and screaming at the sky for a minute, right? And finally, think, which means that when in conflict, our emotions may be the thing that are moving us, right? So it's okay, and it's actually really important to think before responding, right? So we're not driven by the emotion, but we're really driven by, from a place of being open to listening, right? And sometimes when we're driven from our emotion, we're not as clear. So taking that moment to think could be really important, right? Because it's a way for us to also assess the situation in a way that can make it be the least harmful to folks, right? Assessing and trying to figure out how to engage with it. And so we, I don't know if we're going to do this breakout group activity. We could let's try it. We'll do 10 minutes and I'll ask you to see. Yes, we're going to give, I will share a link to the slides for folks to have. So Jackie, if we could do maybe, I don't know, we finish at 3, right? So I don't know if we're gonna have time for the breakout groups.
Yeah, do you want to just have maybe 5 minutes for people to focus on one of the questions, or what do you think, Tanagra?
What I'll do is this. Why don't we ask folks that are volunteers to respond to one of these questions, right? And since you have the slides as well as the materials, I think that part of this is a piece of reflecting that we wanted to engage folks in. And so it doesn't mean that has to stop today, right? Like the hope is that you will be able to continue to engage in this reflective process with not only yourself, with your colleagues, right? So let's do this. So I want you all to think about, or keep in mind the following. What does conflict bring up for me, right? So when we're thinking of conflict, what is my association with that? For some folks, conflict is good. For some of us, we feel it's negative, right? What does it bring up, right? What are the emotions or reactions that I need to regulate? So this is another piece that I would encourage you all to think about, but also share and think through with your colleagues. What strategies do I use to prevent conflict? What are the things that I can do or have done successfully to prevent it, right? And what are some of the ones that I think I can incorporate, right? Like what are some of the things that I've heard today or folks have shared with me that I can incorporate? So think about those things when you're trying to assess how to best navigate situations that are escalating or where there's conflict to be managed, right? So the first piece is my self-awareness, right? And what are the tools that I bring? And what are the tools that I need to incorporate, right? The second piece of this is, the second piece is, how do I adjust my behavior during conflict to make sure that people can voice their needs, right? And so what are the things that I can do to adjust my behavior to make sure that people feel that they're being heard? For me, is to stop giving people suggestions. Like, they didn't ask me to fix it, right? I'm holding space. And so if I'm telling you how to fix it, I'm not listening and I'm not giving you room to voice your needs, right? So I learned that, it's like I'm not in a fixed situation. I am in a listening mode, right? I'm here to hold space. What behaviors or actions make you feel resistance to being flexible, right? So for me, when someone screams at me, I have a hard time with that, right? And so when I have been screamed at participants, that immediately makes me tense up and feel like I want to go into my hierarchical sort of like, this is what you need to do situation, which is not good for de-escalation, right? So absolutely, what are some of the behaviors or actions that make me resist being flexible? And what are some of the ways I can adapt to meet people's needs, right? So making sure that I'm conscious to being open-hearted, with an open mind, right? That I am in a good place. And that, if I am not able to be centered and grounded, to be able to ask a colleague to step in, right? So thinking about those for yourselves. And then finally, what behaviors or actions make you feel resistant to be flexible? What are some of the ways and what are some of the techniques that you can use to take time to think and ground yourself during conflict, right? And for me, like, what are some of the things that, you can say, wow, okay, I need some time. Like, what are some of the things that I can do or say to buy me some time? Sometimes for me, it's to say, hey, I am feeling like I need some coffee or I need something to drink. Would you like me to bring you something from the fridge? Like, I'm happy to bring you a cup of tea or a cup of water, una taza de café, right? And like that moment of going to get that coffee and coming back gives the person room, and also gives me room. Another thing is to sort of say, hey, I need to go, let me really quick go back and grab this that I need to grab. I'll be right back, right? So, going and giving myself some space to be able to ground myself and to be able to feel that I can fully listen, right? It's like just need to do this so I can be fully here because I want to listen to what you have to say. Then I'll be right back. Like, give me 1 second. Right? Those are some things that can at least help me ground during conflict because I need that time to think, right? Breathing is also something that you can use as well. I don't know if folks, but you can do some mindful breathing, and just like, no one needs to know you're doing it, but you can be like, channeling that energy of being centered to help you feel that you have your bearings, right, when you're in conflict. And so, just to review, when we think of conflict management, self-control, prevent, listen, adapt, and think. Those are all really important things that we can keep in mind in order for us to be able to show up to our workplaces and feel that we have the tools, some tools that we can use when we're engaging in situations that potentially could be conflict or that may escalate, right? And absolutely, we will definitely appreciate anybody's, we'll share emails as well. They're in the slides. We would love to hear what you all think. And if you want to share with us your answers, we would love that as well. And as we said, is spatial safety super important. So making sure that we know our spaces are laid out, exits and entrances are super important. And I just want to make sure that we finish with this, which is a note on calling law enforcement. So we know that calling the police many times means it will be a more harmful situation, a more dangerous situation for folks, particularly Black, Indigenous, Latino people of color, right? So really thinking about, the consequences of calling the police that can mean death for some people. And so also it can escalate situations further instead of de-escalating them. And so I would say that it's really important for you all to think about your spaces and the folks you're working with and your organizational structures and see what is the policy around calling law enforcement. And that truly calling law enforcement should be the last resort for truly dangerous situations or life-threatening, right? Like I had a colleague who was working in a domestic violence shelter. One of the ex-partners of one of the women who were in the shelter showed up. He had a knife and a gun, and he broke in and he held them hostage, right? Like that's a situation where you call the cops, right? Because it's definitely like a situation where people's lives were in danger, they were threatened, and clearly this person was there to harm them, right? And there's other times in which we can de-escalate the situation without the presence of law enforcement. And so I would really encourage you to all think about this when you're working with your folks and with your folks. And after situations happen, it's important to debrief and to see what we learned, what we did good, what we did well, and what we want to change, and what would happen next. What are the next steps in terms of accountability and boundaries? And so if we are taking home messages, staff connection to participants, staff connection to each other, clear communication, right, with the intent of connecting, be aware of your surroundings, and recognize escalating behavior to note all those cues, right, so that we are able to, as we note those cues, we can intervene in a moment to be able to de-escalate, because the more the situation gets escalated, the harder it will be to de-escalate later on, right, and we want to minimize harm for people. I really appreciate you all. I'm sorry, I thought, it's like, we would have that space for that breakout group, but I still encourage you all, if you want to share your thoughts or your ideas, we would love to hear them. I will share the slides with Jackie. So Jackie, would you want me to share the link now? Would that feel easier for you, or do you want to share them directly when you share the evaluation? What do you think would work best?
Yeah, so we'll send it out actually tomorrow. And we'll send out the evaluation today, and then we'll send out a PDF of the PowerPoint tomorrow to the entire participants that registered. So we'll send it out for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And please, let us know. I would always welcome feedback. What was helpful, what could have been better. And I'm grateful to have had the time with you all today here. And I hope that we see you in the next sessions that are coming up. So I appreciate you all, and I'm grateful for the work that you do and the commitment that you have to our communities. Thank you so much for giving us these 2 hours of your time. Me vayan bien. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jackie, so much for everything, for helping and organizing it and all.